Friendship aside, was Tolkien a fan of C.S. Lewis, the writer, or the Chronicles of Narnia in general? The answer is generally no, but there's some complexity there. First, I want to wind back the clock and give some context on how these men met and what their friendship was actually like. Not only were they both part of the British Army, they both were fighting along the same exact river in France, separated by only a year. Tolkien participated in the First Battle of the Somme, which was 4 months of absolute devastation. It saw over 1 million casualties. Tolkien would see most of his lifelong close friends killed at the Somme before coming down with trench fever in October of 1916 and returning to England. When you look at The Lord of the Rings, you are seeing this war. When you look at Mordor, you are seeing the trenches. When you look at the industrialization of war, the mechanized wheels that are always turning in the background, pumping out more, you see Isengard. Scouring of the Shire, you see industrialization changing the beautiful green land that you knew as home. There's also hope in Tolkien's writings. There is an acknowledgement that in the face of adversity, the world will stand up and do the right thing. A year later, Lewis would be in the same trenches watching his friends die, and this would have a profound impact on him as well and his faith. Lewis was raised Christian, but he had been an atheist since he was 15. His time in the trenches did not help this at all. Enough, it would be meeting Tolkien in 1926 that would start to bring him back into the fold. Tolkien is the man that rekindled his faith. You must picture me alone in that room at Magdalen College, Oxford, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet, that which I greatly feared and had last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. Now in 1926, Lewis was an English professor at Oxford. Tolkien was a professor as well, with a focus on Anglo-Saxon literature as well as language. Met at a faculty meeting in 1926, immediately hit it off and kicked off a lifelong friendship. Part of a group called the Inklings, they would meet every single Tuesday night at a pub to drink and talk about literature. Tolkien started writing a lot of the mythology behind The Lord of the Rings and thinking about it a lot between 1914 and 1917. 1937 to 1949, he would actually end up writing The Hobbit, The Fellowship, Two Towers, and Return of the King. It was a grueling process for him, which very much started with the creation of the Elvish language and then the elves, and then building out from there, constructing other languages and then other races. As a philologist, someone who studies languages, Tolkien was obsessed with language. These were the building blocks for his entire universe. Tolkien believed in consistency throughout a world and writing in slow, careful detail. This lays the groundwork for one of his complaints with the Chronicles of Narnia. C.S. Lewis would publish 7 books in 6 years. He would finish writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in 1949 for a 1950 publication, finish writing The Magician's Nephew, which was the second to last book in 1954 before its publication in 1955, and then 1956, he would publish The Last Battle, which he had already written before The Magician's Nephew. Fairly widely accepted that the speed at which C.S. Lewis wrote was kind of off-putting to Tolkien. Maybe there was a hint of jealousy there. Or maybe there was a hint of truth there as a criticism of the Chronicles of Narnia. Tolkien felt like they were very much cobbled together, kind of slapped together haphazardly. I talked about before when I talked about Tolkien's feelings towards Dune was he liked his fantasy worlds to be completely separate from our own. Dune takes place in our own distant future after the collapse of a society that's very much been built on the back of AI. Tolkien allegedly found the mixing of our world and a more fantastical one, as well as the mixing of different mythologies and creatures, to be fairly off-putting. We have a direct, vague quote from Tolkien about Narnia. A lot of the rest of this is kind of speculation or pulled from other secondary sources. But he said, quote, "It is sad that Narnia and almost all of C.S. Lewis's work should remain outside the range of my sympathy, as much of my work was outside his." I think that's fair, because C.S. Lewis would allegedly poke fun at how long it took Tolkien to write and the level of detail that he poured into his mythology. An example of something Tolkien allegedly did not like is the inclusion of Mr. Tumnus, a satyr, in a story really for kids. If you know anything about satyrs or fauns and their roles and kind of history and mythology, you will understand why. We felt like Lewis was taking a well-known and meaningful character from mythology and completely changing it to fit his narrative. This felt like this was something authors had the right to do. He said mythical poetry ought not to attempt novelty in respect of its ingredients, but what it does with the ingredients may be as novel as you please. Tolkien also mentioned the idea of Mr. Tumnus having the book Nymphs and Their Ways. Sorta a meta ploy by Lewis to get a laugh. Tolkien would see this as not taking the actual world seriously enough. Criticism I find kind of hilarious from Tolkien is that Narnia is too strong of a Christian allegory. He will say The Lord of the Rings are not a Christian allegory, but there are many scholars that would disagree with him. He described his own work as, quote, fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. The difference is Narnia has a direct representation of Christ in Aslan. The question would be, don't you find Christ in Tolkien's characters as well, just split into 3? You have Gandalf sacrificing his life to be reborn from white light, representing the prophetic aspect of the Messiah. Frodo being struck down by a Morgul blade before being healed by the elves while going on this journey, bearing pretty much the weight of the entire world for our salvation. I argue he represents the priestly or worldly aspect of the Messiah. Finally, you have the kingly aspect of the Messiah with Aragorn, who literally makes a journey to the army of the dead. For his rebirth as their leader, was a king of Gondor, arrives as a savior at Pelennor Fields. There are so many obvious elements of this story, like the literally life-giving, sustaining bread Lembas. Only through Lembas are Frodo and Sam sustained on their journey to save humanity. You really have to dig deep to find the Christian faith in the Lord of the Rings, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I think Tolkien was a little bit harsh in his critiques of Lewis. I think you can find some more hypocrisy from Tolkien if you keep digging. Going back to what I was talking about earlier from mythology, Tolkien felt that there shouldn't be a mix of characters, for example, Lilith, Bacchus, Father Christmas, and the Phoenix, all from different parts of the world, all in the same story. He felt that having the Roman god Bacchus running around in the same world with the European Father Christmas was silly and distracting. At the same time, when scholars look at The Lord of the Rings, they are also seeing influences from all over Europe spanning long stretches of time. Influences from Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, Greek legends, they are all just much better hidden. I think what you can sum up here is that Tolkien felt like it was a little bit too much copy and paste, like he was just plucking things out and then directly dropping them into his world. Listen to Clyde Kilby, Tolkien also felt that Lewis may have done some plucking from him. He said, although Tolkien spoke to me warmly of his long and happy association with Lewis, he also sometimes found fault with him. He mentioned that Lewis borrowed from him. I pointed out that Lewis had acknowledged the borrowing of the word Numenor, but Tolkien insisted there were unacknowledged echoes in Lewis. He would continue by saying he genuinely believed that Lewis had borrowed from his writings and once went so far as a broad hint of plagiarism. Overall, the general consensus seems to be that Tolkien felt like Lewis's work were just rushed, haphazard, kind of slapped together, and surface level. When it comes down to it, these two guys were still very good friends who constantly pushed the other one to keep working, encouraged them to write, and would read each other's stuff even if they didn't like it all the time. With very different styles, very different influences, but bonded by their faith. I guarantee they made each other better over the years, and as the years passed, Tolkien would lighten on Narnia. He would even prompt his own granddaughter to read those books before she read The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien would write, the unpayable debt that I owe him was not influence as is ordinarily understood, but sheer encouragement. He was for long my only audience. Only for him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. But for his interest and unceasing eagerness for more, I should never have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. They did grow apart over the years. When Lewis passed in 1963, 37 years after they met, Tolkien was shaken to the core, saying, so far I have felt the normal feelings of a man my age, like an old tree that is losing all its leaves one by one. This feels like an axe blow near the roots.